As you can see, the other guy's 292 inline 6-cylinder Chevy is up on the dyno and it's running, and it sounds great as always. I stayed up late last night to make sure I got the motor up on the dyno and running so I can get an early start this morning because I got a ton of tests to do. Right now, I'm going to start off with something simple. I'm just going to do the Clifford 4-barrel upgrade. You know, the intake manifold and a single 4-barrel, the way that everybody does it. But here's my question. I'm going to test all of the intake manifolds after that, but the simple 4-barrel intake upgrade, how much power is it worth? But more than that, I want to find out, do we need a 4-barrel on that intake manifold? Are the gains from the intake design, or are the gains from having more airflow from the 4-barrel? You'll remember, if you take a look at this other video right here, I ran the stock intake manifold with a 1-barrel, with a 2-barrel, with a 4-barrel, and then silly with a Dominator. Now we know that the opening in the factory intake manifold is basically going to restrict flow. But when I put the Clifford intake manifold on there with the 4-barrel opening, the intake itself should add power. But do we really need a 4-barrel on that intake manifold? So I'm going to do the Clifford intake upgrade, then I'm going to swap between a 4-barrel and a 2-barrel and find out how much airflow that intake really needs. Chevy with the stock intake and 2-barrel Holly, let's swap things over to the Clifford intake. Looks like we've got the intake on. We've got a 650 Holly on this thing with our adapter. 12-volt shout out. And our throttle linkage hooked up. Let's start it up. See how she does. Well, we run the 4-barrel on the Clifford intake. Now it's time to swap over to the 2-barrel. I want to see if there's any difference between the 2-barrel and 4-barrel on that 4-barrel intake. Sometimes you gotta make your own adapter gasket. Yeah, Gorilla Tape. Before we take a look at our intake manifold and 4-barrel versus 2-barrel upgrade, we have to remember where we all started. This was a 292 inline 6-cylinder Chevy, and when we ran this thing stock, meaning with the stock exhaust manifolds and a section of exhaust pipe basically, and the stock intake manifold with the stock 1-barrel carburetor, we just put it up there, you know, adjusted the timing and made sure everything was working right and just ran it. So in stock trim, run in that manner with the, we were still driving the water pump and the alternator, although the alternator was not generating a fuel, the water pump was pumping water and cooling the motor. So run in this manner, our stock 292 Chevy produced 145 horsepower and 247 foot-pounds of torque, although this starting point is probably just the stationary load in
I think it might have been a little bit less than that, but we'll show. I only ran this thing down to 2300 when I initially did this test, but we can take a look now and see we've I actually loaded it a little bit lower than that. So here's what happened when we put headers and the 2-barrel intake manifold on here. You see we got some good gains. The headers picked up a lot here in the middle, but also the 2-barrel manifold picked up. So the peak numbers jumped up to 158.7, almost 159 horsepower. And peak torque, again, was 271 foot-pounds. You see we started the load there at 1900. But again, the big jump up there at the beginning is probably just a stationary load. But this thing's making good torque, and even more so with the headers and the 2-barrel. The 2-barrel obviously helped things out too, even though we're still having to breathe through that single 1-barrel opening. But here's what happened after we installed the Clifford 4-barrel intake with a Holley 650 4-barrel carburetor. The peak power jumped up to 166 horsepower. And as you can see, where the stock intake manifold, even with the 2-barrel, would have been falling off at 3,900 RPM to 4,000. The other one didn't fall off nearly as bad, and so the difference in power between the two would have been even greater. But the interesting thing is, after running that 650 4-barrel manifold on there, I wanted to find out, does it really need 650 CFM to make 166 horsepower? Probably not. So I put a 2-barrel on there with interesting results, although by no means like finalize an optimum here. So the red now is the 2-barrel, and as you can see, the 2-barrel made basically identical power at 3,500 RPM. It was a little bit lower out here, but it was quite a bit lower here. Now, when running the 2-barrel, we noticed that the 2-barrel was an awful lot leaner in this area than the 4-barrel was. And then they kind of evened up out here. So I would tend to think that given this power output, 500 CFM from a 2-barrel probably would feed that motor, even though we're seeing a little bit of discrepancy here. But I think that that's air fuel, and there's no way for me to go in and do jets or air bleeds or anything that's going to change the air fuel just at between 2,500 and 3,000 RPM. I know that all the CARB experts would tell me, yes, you could definitely do that, but you can certainly do that with fuel injection, but I've just never seen anybody do it with a carburetor, and to continue and not to have it, make a difference out here at the top. But I think that ultimately the 2-barrel probably is enough. It would be better to have a 4-barrel. We did have to run an adapter to run the 4-barrel on the Clifford manifold because it's actually designed for a WCFB. It's designed for a very small 4-barrel carburetor and not a typical Holley and not a quadrajet. So I would like to see that manifold done so that it's supposed to accept a more modern traditional kind of 4-barrels. But we had to run an adapter on it, and that worked okay. We also had to run an adapter for the 2-barrel, so we had to run the Holley, style 4-barrel adapter, and then a 2-barrel on top of that. So again, I think that if we would have just had a 2-barrel adapter by itself on a manifold that was designed to accept a 4-barrel, this probably would have been a better combination. But as you can see, we're up quite a bit from our original starting point. So here at 3,000 RPM, we were at 233 foot-pounds, and then now we're at 270 foot-pounds. So good torque gains there. And I think that this all points to the fact that we have a stock cam in here and stock cylinder heads, and we really need to upgrade those things to where we can really start taking advantage of what these intake manifolds have to offer, and possibly also what the header has to offer. So let's get to our conclusion.
We finished the intake upgrade on our 292 inline 6-cylinder Chevy, the other guy's inline 6-cylinder Chevy. And what did you guys think? I have to be honest with you. The number I was thinking of before I went into this, I wanted like 175 horsepower. But it is what it is. And if we take a look back, go, hey, remember when we ran this thing when it was bone stock? Stock exhaust manifold, stock intake manifold, stock 1-barrel carburetor. And it made about 144, 145 horsepower. So we're up like 20 horsepower compared to that original beginning with an intake and a set of headers, which that's a pretty good gain. I know what you guys are thinking, well, 20 horsepower, that's some of you guys are thinking 20 horsepower, that's really not very much. And 20 horsepower is always 20 horsepower, but when you compare 20 horsepower to the original of 145 horsepower, the percentage gain from the intake manifold and headers is actually pretty good size. So that's what happens when you start with an inline 6-cylinder Chevy. This is not making a ton of power. We don't get huge gains from simple bolt-on parts like this, but I think we're going to see more when we do things like the cylinder head, obviously when we do camshafts, and then if we did an intake upgrade, the gains would be even greater. But it's a good start. I like the Clifford intake. I like the headers. We have more power, so that's always good. And I've got some cool stuff coming up for you. We ran all of the intake manifolds. We ran the Clifford, we ran the Offenhauser, as you can kind of see here. We also ran this nice guy over here. Or at least we tried to run them. I may or may not have some tales of woe for you coming up in the next video, but that's all part of the deal. It just goes to show you, not every time when I do a test does everything go perfectly, and anybody else that does any dyno, and anybody else that's ever worked on a car, you guys all know, it never goes perfect, and it doesn't always go perfect for me, although a sunny disposition always helps. Arbiter Holder guys, thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. I got more of this stuff coming up, more Buick stuff coming up. And yes, I'm going to do some LS stuff too eventually, which is also cool. Thanks guys.